Okay. We'll be starting in 2 minutes, folks. Just making sure things are working. Perfect. Okay. And we'll be starting up in about 1 more minute. Give folks a couple of seconds to join us, and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning, and welcome to another one of our foundational webinars. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads program. And hope everybody's having a good day and you're ready for the storm that's coming in. I'm not ready. I haven't really looked at the forecast enough. I need to do that myself. So we're going to get started, and we're going to be talking today about employee handbooks. Okay, so just so everybody's on the same page. This is not a PDH worthy session, just so you know, for those who are engineers. But we still think this is a valuable session, again, as part of this foundational series that we're trying to do over 2 years to give people information they can use to set everything up. Audio settings are again at the bottom on your screen. The chat pod, I would advise you to open that up. We're going to put a link or two in there during the course of the day that might be useful for you. May ask you to raise your hands now and then. That's button also at the bottom. The Q&A is the place you're going to put in your questions, and we definitely want your questions. We're going to be using that, plus the polls, which we'll talk about a little bit more. That will also, we'll get a link to that showing up in the chat pod as well, so you don't have to memorize anything. The rest of our spring foundational webinars, or late winter, or whatever season this is, mud season, we'll be doing employee handbooks today. We've got 3 more after that: pavement maintenance, something on grants and revenue, state and local aid, and then we're going to be finishing up with erosion ditches and storm sewers. And as you see, 2 of them are worth professional development hours. That's what the asterisk means. 2 of them are not. All of these are recorded. So the reason I left the other ones up there is they're all recorded. So you can go back and look at them if you weren't able to watch them earlier. Again, trying to get you started. Hopefully get you interested too in the classes that go with a lot of these. And you can come to a full day class and we'll see you in person. So a quick welcome, some updates. And again, this is the site you're going to want to go to for the polls that we're going to be doing online. And if you've got your chat pod open, it's there as well. You can just click on the link and you don't have to type that in, but it's pollev.com/DavidOrrPE. And we're going to be talking about employee handbooks. And the reason I've got the LTAP logo on there, and if you don't know, we're part of a national association of centers like our own in every single state. And a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, off by 1 week, we did a session on motivating, recruiting, and retaining your employees. An employee handbook is really related in a lot of ways to that. So we'll be talking about that during the course of our hour together. To help me out and see who's on the call and might make some changes, let's get started. Again, to deal with some of the fun stuff, who do you work for? So we'll see, that one's already active. So a few folks had already clicked in. We've got some county folks, a few town, some consultants, okay, cities and villages are represented, state and fed. If you can't get to these, you can put them into the Q&A. I can look at the Q&A and then magically Jody and Amanda, who are in the background, will clear those for me. So we have some city folks online as well. Okay, that's good to know. Again, I'm definitely looking for your feedback and your ideas here. Okay. Okay, that's useful. What is your job title? That's actually pretty useful for me. Let me find my mouse. My mouse likes to disappear sometimes. What is your job? What do? Are you administrator, superintendent, or commissioner, engineer? You're out in the field crew, you're on the elected board, supervisor, legislator, whatever, or none of the above. You can always do the old none of the above. Let's see what we got here. So again, quite a few engineers, some superintendents, some crew supervisors, field crews themselves, none of the above. Okay. And then in the chat pod, I'm seeing superintendent, project coordinator, supervisor, an MEO, truck driver. Cool. Good to know. And then lastly, how long have you been in your current position? Less than a month, less than a year, more than 20 years, 3 to 5. Just pick a thing that also helps me quite a bit. It also is something you want to think about. If you're new, less than a year, you may want to reach out to other folks who have been around for a while. If you've got a lot of experience, you might want to look and see, are we doing things just because we've always done them? Or is this really the right thing to be doing? And we'll talk about that a couple of times when we build our employee handbook later on. Okay. So I see 20 years, 5 to 10 additional, less than a year. Some people with over 20 plus years, 26. Cool. Okay. So we got a good variety. I like to see that. That's useful. And then let's just see where you're from. You can click on the map and tell me where you're from, or again, you can throw it into the Q&A. So we have a couple in Rochester, Long Island. Okay, starting to populate all over the place. Got a Binghamton listed in the Q&A. Okay. Cicero, North Syracuse, in addition to the dots. And our friend who's joined us from Lake Ontario isn't there today, though. Probably now that I mentioned it, somebody will pop it into Lake Ontario and go swimming. Okay. So that's useful. We get folks from all over the state, and the problems we've got are the true upstate, downstate. I was in New York City yesterday with the Association of Towns annual meeting. Employee issues are the same there. I even met some folks who do with some of these employee handbook kind of things. In last year's webinar on retaining and motivating and finding employees, we talked about retaining employees quite a bit. And really, if you think about your employee handbook, actually can help you because it is an explicit written way to show what you're doing and helping create that chance to get leadership and retain employees by giving them paths forward. It can be part of the employee handbook because I think everybody agrees employees are your most valuable resource. They're more valuable than any piece of equipment, any building, and we need to both keep them safe, but also make them part of the overall equation. And the handbook can go a long ways to do that. Now, last year we did a survey, and we do a survey every year. Last year we talked about salaries and positions that are hard to fill. And what came up, of course, was it's hard to find good equipment operators, mechanics, specific, specialists for water and wastewater. And we had folks saying, it's just hard, the board won't let me replace folks. Well, at some point we have to keep the people that we've got, and we're going to have to fill some in. But when you bring somebody on board, the things that came up in the survey were issues of pay, okay, attitude, how do you get people as part of the team, making sure you had skilled personnel, how do you train those skilled personnel, and then of course there were other issues that were mentioned. But really, a lot of what we're going to talk about today can actually help you with some of the challenges you get from new and your old hires. Now let's just see by a show of another one of these lovely polls, how many of you actually have an employee handbook? Okay, so the answers are yes, no, you're not sure. You have a contract, so it's part of your contract, Or it's in addition to the contract. So you have a contract document and you have an employee handbook, 2 documents, or some other arrangement. So I'll get some yeses in the Q&A. And that's right, I got to turn on poll everywhere. I got to turn the responses on so we can see them. Here we go. So about half of you have one, a little more than half, counting the folks in the Q&A, and about a quarter of you don't have one. And then lots of you have one that's part of your contract personnel policy. Okay. Okay, so that's useful to know. For those who have a personnel policy, how old is it? How long have you had it in place? And whatever you put down in writing, make sure you realize that don't make a promise you can't keep. An employee handbook is actually a promise. It's actually a statement of here's what we're going to do. Okay. And again, it may be part of your overall contract. It might be just something that you put together by the superintendent. There's different structures. I'm not getting into whether it's a union or non-union shop, but if you have a contract, realize that contract is setting that controls in a lot of ways. And we could have a whole hour talking about negotiations and stuff like that. But let me ask you, if you had a perfect world, no contract and all that stuff, if you could start from scratch, let's fill out and ask yourself, what should be covered in the employee handbook? And again, go to polleverywhere.com, and I'm just going to go ahead and put the responses up on the screen. Okay, so let's put in there what should be in the employee handbook. Code of conduct, okay. Time off, okay. Benefits, okay. Duties, work schedule, yeah. Responsibilities, discipline steps, employer responsibilities, as well as the employee. Yeah, that's actually pretty good. Okay, safety issues should be in there. Okay. Directions, emergency contacts, possibly. Yeah, okay. You could put lots of things in your employee handbook. It could get fairly thick, fairly quick. We'll talk about that a little bit too, but okay, so it's really important to think about what's going to be in there. There's the overarching items, some of them you listed there, such as expectations and codes of conduct and things like that. But you also want some specific things in there about time off, family leave, what is the vacation rules, what is the schedule for work. Okay, so you're going to have a balance of these things, and we'll talk about a balance when you're building an employee handbook as well. And I see in the Q&A we have time, vacation benefits, work time, things like that. What I recommend anybody who wants to build an employee handbook do, start with what is the responsibilities of your department. Okay, and we've shown this in several of our webinars because it's so important. If you don't have a good list of what you're responsible for, you really have a hard time with liability, with safety, with management, and in development of an employee handbook, because then you'll not be sure what is important, what justifies overtime, what's a critical safety function, all these things. So you really want to think about responsibilities. So we'll do this again. We've done this before. If you had to put one word down, what are some responsibilities of your department? Okay, one word. You can put in more than one, by the way, and we'll build ourselves another Wordle. Safety, yeah. Safety both for the workers and for the public. Maintenance of the road system, yeah. Okay. Let's see what else we've got in here. The service to the public. See safety over in the Q&A. Okay. Your schedule, yeah, that's actually pretty important as a communication tool with the public. Okay. And again, today we're getting more of an overview kind of thing, but you may want to write down specific things, but come back to thinking about how you're going to then translate that back into your employee handbook. And you want to list those responsibilities out and then look at your employee handbook and see if they match up. Do you have things in there that don't make sense? Did you borrow a handbook from somebody else that talks about work on sewer systems and you don't have a sewer system? So it's pretty important to make sure that there's a lineup between what you say is an employee handbook and what is it you're doing as a department, okay? And of course, for towns, getting out a copy of the Office of Town Highway Superintendent. With a village, there's a guidebook for village officials. Talking to your friends and your neighbors. We have a thing on managing your department. There's all kinds of ways to go get a list of those activities. But why does this translate then into an employee handbook? Let's start with an example. We'll come back to this example, but let's start with one. And we're going to start with personal protective equipment, specifically hard hats. We'll come back to general PPE in a minute, or a few minutes actually. So here's an example of a hard hat that saved somebody from at least a serious injury when the hard hat got hit by a tree limb and the hat actually broke. But it did it in the way that's supposed to break, so that rather than putting that energy into someone's head, it put it into the helmet, and they walked away essentially with a scare, but that's about all. Versus these engineers, yes, they are engineers, who didn't want to put their hard hats on, even though that was the policy, because, well, if a big rock falls, it's going to kill them. Well, yeah, but it's little pebbles that could give them a concussion. That is the reason they should be wearing the hard hat in this particular case. But let me ask you this. Who sets the hard hat policy? And by the way, you can select more than one choice. Okay? You can select more than one choice. Oops, whoops. Let me go back up. So you can choose everything from federal policy all the way down to crew leader, and we'll see how you guys do. Okay. So who sets the hard hat policy? And somebody is putting the Q&A all can, someone is putting in the law or regulations. Yeah, okay. And this is a good example of where policies can be very helpful, okay? And an employee handbook becomes a written policy. And who can set a policy? Well, generally we start at the crew leader level, though truth be told, workers can set their own safety policy if they want. But we start usually at the crew leader level, and we go all the way up to federal policy in some cases. And generally, the higher you go in this list, they supersede what's below, unless the lower one is more stringent. So for instance, if the state PESH law says you're supposed to, and federal policy says you're supposed to wear a vest in the right of way, which it does, you could also have a policy that says you wear a vest in other locations. But we'll talk about why that's also got some risk to it as well. But generally, the superintendent can set a policy. The board can supersede that policy. It may be part of a contract. Once it's in the contract, that becomes controlling unless there's a state law or a federal policy on top of it. So when you think about writing up your employee handbook, realize that in some cases you want to reference other policies, and don't write it into the handbook any more than you have to, but make sure you then know where to get that policy if one exists. So if you have a contract, you have an employee handbook, you want to refer to that contract and try to limit the language. Don't overlap too much, because what you don't want to get, and this creates issues for folks, is you've got a contract that says A, you've got an employee handbook that says B, rather than referring to the contract, and now something happens, you may actually be held to both. So general good rule is reference other documents and make sure you've got a good, usually these days a link, but make sure people know where those documents are as well, or you can even put them together as a single combined document. The other thing is once you put it in writing, okay, realize you've now set a written policy and those policies control. Do we really need to write a policy that says this is a bad idea? This comes from our webinar we did on worker safety, thanks to Phil Spezio. Yeah, we all know this isn't right. You look at the side of the ladder, it says you shouldn't be standing on the top of that ladder, and yet we've all seen examples like this. Now, this was staged just for creating a picture, but if you think about it, this is the kind of things, do we really want to put that in writing? And that sounds like a minor issue, but it's actually a pretty important one. And that is because once you put something in writing, once it's in your employee handbook, it is a policy. And policies are a little like this wrought iron gate that's around one of the gardens here at the university. That, by the way, the gate fence doesn't go all the way around, it's just on one end. So it doesn't really keep people out. But it's set in this case, metal, but it's set in stone. It's now the policy. You got to follow it. And a good policy is great because now everybody knows what it is. It's explicit. People can read it. They can follow it. Great. We're in good shape. But that's for a good policy versus a bad policy. And we've all seen that where somebody wrote something up. The intentions were good, but now we're following that policy more than we're following anything better. So as an example that I gave earlier with the vest, you could have a policy that says you have to wear a vest in the right of way, but do you always need to be wearing a vest in the job 100% of the time? Maybe, maybe not. And if you have the wrong kind of vest, it could actually create safety issues. Okay, so think about that. And you've all think about times when you've seen good and bad policies. One of my favorites I saw in time when a purchasing policy required that the superintendent get permission from the board to spend more than $50. Anything above $50 had to have board approval. So they got a flat tire on the grader and they just had to put the grader on the side of the road until they got board approval. But it was in writing. So now what do? So I'm not saying you shouldn't put things in writing. You should. But remember, once you created an explicit policy, that becomes controlling. So I'm a firm believer in the KISS principle. Now, what we're going to do today, we're going to spend some of our time on building a policy, and we're going to use a policy from the town of Preble. Okay. Now, the link is here, but it also is going to show up in the chat pod. So you don't have to type all this out. You can actually just click on the link in the chat pod. We're going to use that as a discussion point. You're welcome to download it. But what I will tell you right now is this is one example. If you want to build a policy, go get several policies, but don't just use them straight up. They're living documents. You really want to take and get several examples and make a living document out of it, okay? And in fact, I know that the town of Preble is looking at redoing their policy. So they may be making changes to the one we have on our website. I am going to make an appeal to you, and I am serious about this. If you've got a policy that you like, that you think is really a good one to share, we'd love to see it. We'd love to be able to share it with others and have 4 or 5 good examples of personnel policies, employee handbooks that we can share with other folks. So you have examples, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but realize it's a living document. Even contracts are living documents, but they only change when you negotiate them. But things change, and when those changes occur, we need to put them down. And again, decide whether you want to put it in writing and be explicit or not. And the other thing I'm a big fan of is the KISS principle. You all know what KISS stands for. Keep it simple, Dave. I'm not the best speller in the world, but the KISS principle is pretty important. Put things in writing that need to be there, but don't get overly flowery. Don't write all this language that actually confuses people. I've seen that happen way too often, where we try to write every single possible thing into the rules. And if you want an example of that, just think about any sport that you follow. If you've ever read the rule book for most sports, they get thicker and thicker and thicker. Oh, and by the way, they have cases that go with it. You have to read the cases, and it can get really complicated. And then you're trying to decide, was that a penalty or not? And the same thing is true with a personnel policy. Try to put it in good, simple, clear language that everybody understands and people will actually read. I'd rather have a short policy that people read, follow, and understand than a really thick one that sits on a shelf and only shows up when something happens, after someone gets hurt, after an incident occurs, after we've started discipline procedures. So really think about keeping it simple. And a little bit of humor goes a long way sometimes, not in the employee handbook, but hopefully you'll understand this. I showed up, I got this at somebody had pasted this over a urinal. I don't understand why, but yeah, think about it. Don't put things in writing that you later on regret, okay? So have a little bit of fun. And what I want to do now is I want to go through what's in the policy from Preble and a couple of other things that I know need to be in most employee handbooks and walk through what should be in there. How you organize it, that's up to you. The first thing they've got in there is full-time versus part-time employees. Okay, that's actually pretty important. You need to define full-time, part-time, seasonal, all kinds of different employee characteristics. Okay, you may do that directly in your employee policy. You might have a contract. So let me just ask you, do you have an agreement with your employees? No. You've only done things verbally? Yes, an informal one. Yes, in writing, or a negotiated contract. So if you had to choose from that list, what would you select? And if you don't have any of those, you could throw it in the Q&A. But what do you have is an agreement, and then I'll come down here and start showing the results and see what we have. So a quarter of you don't. We have an agreement. 30. I'm getting some answers here. Yes, in writing, and then about half you have a negotiated contract. Okay. Okay, so we'll let folks get a couple of answers in here. And again, if you can't access the poll everywhere, which is in the chat, it's poll everywhere or pollev.com/DavidOrPE. You can just put it into the Q&A. We can do that. So about a third of you don't have one, a third of you have one in writing, and about a third of you have a negotiated contract. Okay. If you have a negotiated contract, that doesn't preclude you from having an employee handbook in addition. But as I said earlier, what you really want to do then is the employee handbook should reference the contract for those who are covered by the contract. That happens here at Cornell, where they've got policies, lots of policies, and those policies will reference those who are covered by contracts and those who are not. Because obviously the contract would control the things that are at least inside of that contract. Okay, so that's useful. Then you can have one handbook that references the contract, and maybe even put those two together and have the most current contract in a place where everybody can read and find it, communicate everything. Okay. So let me ask you this. Working hours. That's important, really, especially in the world of DPWs. Working hours make a big difference because it changes when you're going to have overtime. It changes a lot of other characteristics. So that's important to know. Okay, so your working hours. Do you have winter or summer hours? So just again, this helps me, and also we'll talk about this for a second. No, you have the same schedule all year round for your crews. Yes, you have a 4-day in the summer. Yes, you have shifts in the winter. It gets changed and it's set by the superintendent, or none of the above, which could mean that it's in the contract. But okay, so you don't have, some people have the same all year so far. And then I'll turn the results on the screen so everybody can see them. Okay, so about half of you are same schedule all year. Some of you have 4-day summer, some of you have shifts in the winter. And if you have none of the above, I would like to know what that is. Just throw it in the Q&A, just so we can, talk about this a little bit. And this actually is a really good example of why putting things in writing can create issues. We had a question that came in our inbox. In fact, I still need to actually get the details back on the question. I sent a quick email, at least I hope it went through, that said we're looking at it. But the policy was written of what the hours were going to be, but the superintendent had been changing things. And now all of a sudden somebody found this handbook that nobody had looked at. Well, of course, if you put it in writing, that controls. And so suddenly the superintendent's hands were tied and they didn't have the flexibility. And some of the employees didn't even like it. They actually wanted the flexibility, but the problem is now it's in writing. And once it's in writing, that controls. And it would have to be a board change in this case, because it'd been a board approved employee handbook. So be careful about that and make sure that your department is not essentially missed when they write a town-wide employee handbook or citywide employee handbook, and they forget about that you might have shift work, that you have shifts in the winter, that you might do 4 days in the summer. Okay, when is overtime, things like that. So decide what you've got and make sure you've written down the things that need to be written down so that everybody understands. I know quite a few departments, for instance, where the office staff works 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and the field crews are 4 days in the summer or shift work in the winter. So again, write down what you need to write down. don't write down what you don't need to write down. Now, at the same time, you've hired your employees, your full-time people, we talked about that, part-time people, but you might hire somebody new and you might have them on probationary status. Now, probationary status varies. Sometimes it's written as a contract, sometimes it's written in other ways, okay? By the way, somebody made a great point. Work hours due to COVID changed many operations. Updates should be in order. Well, that's the way that we're talking about this now. This is a perfect time as we're coming out of COVID. We really are starting to reestablish our new normal. This is a perfect time to redo your handbook. Now that you sort of realize, okay, this worked, this didn't work. You know, like we've added webinars, you can do these kind of things. But let's look at probationary employees. You hire somebody brand new. There are certain protections, especially in the case of contracts, but there's certain protections that occur once somebody is considered full-time or even part-time, but they're no longer probationary. It may be in your contract, it may be written down in your handbook what that is, but I just want to know personally, not what you've got currently for a policy. Personally, what would you choose as a probationary period for a new person? This is the time at which, during that probationary period, if they don't meet the needs of the department or they don't meet certain criteria, you can let them go without much trouble. So let's just see what people think, and then I'll show the results here. And we'll talk about what people are putting in the chat as well. Okay. And in the Q&A, we're getting similar results: 12 months, 6 months, a year, okay, 3 months. And it may not be the same for every employee. I know that, or every position. But think about, how long do you want that person to be probationary, to where certain changes in terms of discipline procedure and things like that. And yes, probation is certainly going to be impacted by any kind of contract, any kind of civil service. It may be rules, for instance, rate point, volunteer firemen have half the probation in a lot of cases, okay? That's the reason why I wanted to bring this up. What you would choose and what you have in your handbook may not match. Make sure you know what's in the handbook or in the contract. That's going to be what controls. And if you really think there's a value in changing it, you got to work towards either changing it in the employee handbook or negotiating it if it's in the contract. You want to make sure that everything aligns, because otherwise you create yourself problems. And we've all known, either in our own departments or neighbors, who've had a situation where somebody got penalized because they were probationary and all of a sudden they were laid off, or vice versa. You couldn't get rid of somebody who wasn't going to work out. So make sure you've got this in good writing and everybody understands what the rules are for probationary periods and who changes that status. And then, of course, this is a fun one. A lot of times, if you have an agreement, contract, it's going to be set, but the wages are really key, okay? So let's just ask, who sets the wages in your particular department? Is it the contract? Is it the board? Is it the board with the superintendent? Does the superintendent actually have some ability to set the raises? You just have cost of living, that's all you've had, and you don't see anything changing on that, or none of the above. And again, I'll let y'all put some answers in, then I'm going to show the results. And again, you're welcome to throw them in the Q&A. Okay, so let's see what we have for results here. Okay, so the contract or the board is by far the most common. And again, by the way, just so you know, this is not surprising to me in the slightest. If you have an agreement, that usually sets the raises, okay? And the board is by far the second choice. And a lot of times it is just cost of living only, or not even cost of living, okay? And I'm seeing in the Q&A, the board is showing up quite often, or the contract, okay? And you realize, of course, that I'm talking about in general, every position might be different. You might have a different contract for your field crew than you have for the office staff. You might not even have a contract for some employees, okay? And some raises are set by other factors. Here at the university, we get raises based upon what the trustees, which is our board, set. So it's a board-only situation unless it's a contract. So we have both types of employees. again, do you want to put this in writing? Does it get into the employee handbook? But if you have a contract, don't put it in the employee handbook. Put it in, hey, you've got to see the contract. Here's the link to the contract, or the contract is attached at the back. And then, of course, that leads to the really important question that everybody really cares about, and that is, what are your rules for overtime? Callbacks, all of these issues. You need to think about those ahead of time. And they're all tied back to the wages. They're tied back to your working hours. You know, is it overtime based upon the federal standard of 40 hours? But there are places where I've seen contracts that gave overtime if they work more than the standard day. You could put that in a contract. Okay, so you would actually get overtime every time you work more than 8 hours. And of course, you have to by federal law when it's above 40 hours. But again, how do you work that out? What happens with shift work? Okay, what happens with all of the other time off that people get? Okay, so think about what you need to put in writing versus what is built in the contract versus what is agreed to. This is one I would put in writing because it's so critical and so important. We want everybody to be on the same page. And of course, what's the call out procedure? Do you get a minimum number of hours for call outs? And of course, nights versus weekends, things like that. And then of course, there's holidays and holiday pay. You know, you get double pay, triple pay? Is it just single pay? I do know of agencies that do not give out extras for holiday pay unless it's overtime. You probably need to put that one in writing. Okay, so let's just see what holidays people get. And we'll talk about holidays when we see what people get. So what holidays do you get? Just try to do one word, by the way. It makes a prettier picture, but we'll come in here and see what people get for holidays. MLK Day, okay. Major holidays, okay. Federal holidays. Some people get all federal holidays. Okay, some people get all state holidays, which don't always match up. Some people get Black Friday the day after Thanksgiving, okay. Some people get just 10 days, they can move around. Some people get Good Friday off. That's not as common anymore. It used to be fairly common. Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day or whatever day you want to call that particular day in October is one that has gone in and out of favor with different agencies. Here's the thing about holidays. Be aware of the fact that once you put it in writing, you may create yourself a situation where you can have changed what the holidays are. If you want to do federal holidays, say federal holidays, okay? Because when something changes, you may actually be changing the holidays that are available. Juneteenth is now a federal holiday in June, so we get a federal holiday in June now. If you had not put down federal holidays, but listed the specific dates, those would be the days off. Because remember, local agencies do not have to take federal holidays. That's actually a myth. There are very few exceptions, but generally it's set by the local agency. So if you wrote down the holidays you're going to give people, but you wanted them to have all the federal days, well, you may not. Versus if you had just written federal holidays and one gets added, like one was added with Juneteenth, now suddenly it's a day off that you might not have been expecting. So think about what holidays you give and which ones you're going to put in writing. And again, of course, you might have a contract that sets some of those dates as well. And don't assume, because again, one of those cases where I would definitely want to put those in writing ahead of time so everybody's on the same page. And of course, what's the wages that go with those holidays? Okay. And of course, beyond the holidays, what other leave do people get? You know, what is your policy for sick, vacation, flexible personnel? Okay, and some agencies have sick specifically different than flexible or personnel time. Some just have one big pool, certain number per year. Do you have emergency leaves, bereavement leaves? Who's included in those bereavement leaves? You know, what is your family? Do you have a policy that specifically says, you know, parents, children, spouse, that's it? Or further than that? Or do you have the superintendent or the supervisor can allow you extra people? I've seen both. most commonly we specifically call it out. And then do you allow people to go to a funeral? Obviously, there are some leaves that are required, like jury duty. Do you have maternity leave? That's a great question that was popped in there. Absolutely critical question. Do you have maternity leave? And how long is that maternity or paternity leave? Okay, so these are the kind of things that you put in. Now, this is something you may not have done. I would definitely advise you doing this. But how many total days of leave do most employees get? Just think about, in an average year, you might have to just make some assumptions about the number of sick days people take. They may not take all of them, but how many total days of leave do most employees get in a given year? You might have to go back and look at your records, and this is something you might want to go back and look at before you finalize your policy. I'll explain why in just a second, but let's see what you got for responses here. Got a bit of a bell curve. I figured we might. Okay. In the Q&A, we're seeing less than 10. We're seeing 21 to 30 plus. Okay. So why is this important? Well, if you've got a set of number of days off, you have to manage for those numbers of days off because people may not be there. May not be there in the winter, they may not be there in the summer. When do people typically take their vacation? Right now here in Ithaca, because just like a lot of school districts, it's a week off, there's not as many employees around, okay? So if you're managing things, you've got to manage them around when people take time off. When do you need to bring extra folks in? Your total number of working days, days in the field, are going to be different based upon the days people have for leave. And by the way, it's really important people have leave. If you want to retain people, you need to give them good, clear, consistent, and frankly, useful leave policies. If they get restrictive, it's one of those things we can actually control to help people out. So it's something that we want to think about. How many leaves do you get, both a management standpoint and a retaining employees standpoint? Okay, let's talk about another fun one here. Now, I said earlier I'd come back to personal protective equipment. A lot of contracts and a lot of agreements, if they just have an agreement, include the agency paying for safety shoes. Okay, usually it's a fixed amount of money. We do that here. Our lab manager gets an allocation because it's required for the job for him to have safety shoes. He gets an allocation for safety shoes. I, on the other hand, buy my own. Again, depends on how you set things up. Well, if you've got a policy like that, you need to write down what's important versus do you write it down at all? And of course, that's true for other personal protective equipment. It may or may not be part of the policy in the employee handbook, but it may be something you want to think about. You are required to provide certain safety equipment if it's required for the job, but there's ways to do it either with a contract or ways to do it in the employee handbook. What PPE are provided by your department? Okay, we'll let you put a few in. We'll see what we've got. But didn't want to go forward. I wanted to show the results before we show mine. Shoes, hard hats, boots, safety vests. Okay. All required PPE are provided by the departments. A lot of departments actually provide shirts. Some days they provide them, these days are starting to provide them with the stripes already built into the shirt. Coats if required, boots, glasses, masks. Okay. And again, what parts do you put into the employee handbook? What might be covered by a contract? Do you just provide a set of money, which again is the most common for boots, where you get a fixed amount of money, and if you want to get something fancier or you need to buy it more often than once a year, that's your call. But you then put the onus on the employee. But generally, when those policies are set up, they're actually allowed to use those boots anywhere. But then they have to replace them if they go bad. Well, what's your policy about that? I want to put some things in writing. Are glasses covered? Okay, safety glasses are certainly covered. But what about prescription glasses? Is there any coverage for that? Which leads us perfectly into our next item, and that's insurance. What do you have for insurance for your employees? Okay. Now, there's Bernie. This is actually Bernie Meyer, the big cheese. we did a thing at the highway school talking about ADA issues and people in wheelchairs and giving people experience, which they may not like being in a wheelchair. But let's just ask, what insurance do you have for your employees? What is covered by your health insurance? General health insurance, medical stuff. Do you have optical, i.e. glasses? Do you have dental, long-term medical? You're not sure. Do you have other things? And if you do, throw them into that. And by the way, somebody before, mentioned not in the union, you might have to pay for some things yourself. And again, what do you put in the handbook versus what is it that you have in a contract versus just we assume. Don't assume in some cases. Okay, let's go see what the results are here. Okay, and you should be able to put in more than one. You should be able to actually put in, I think, 5 of the 6. I did not let you do all 6 because if you aren't sure, you probably aren't putting the other choices down. Okay, and then of course people are putting in the Q&A some things. Some people said general health plus other options. Some say general dental reimbursement at 80%. Some people said prescription glasses, and it changes. I mean, I've been here quite a few years, and what is available and what isn't available has changed over time. Okay, and of course, just because it's covered by the health insurance doesn't mean people always accept it. I know more than a few folks who don't like their choices, so they do their own thing for dental or glasses or things like that. And so what's in the health insurance? There again, try not to put too much into the employee handbook if it's either in a contract or the town negotiates health insurance and you're covered by that health insurance. Okay. And of course, that leads to the question about retirement as well. What's your retirement policy? That also is something you need to make sure everybody's on board with. Okay. And yes, a great point raised up in the Q&A. Sometimes a spouse has better insurance. So they might be covered by the spouse's insurance and not covering at all through the municipality. That's cool. But what do you have in your policy available, not necessarily used by the employees, both for health and retirement benefits? Okay. Now here's an example of something that certainly changed quite a bit. And there was a time when we allowed people to actually use municipal equipment, not so much the vehicles, but like tools and stuff like that. These days, pretty much we've said, no, sorry, you can't do those things. There's just too much risk involved. So we pretty much said in writing, hey, nope, you can't use it except for work for the municipality, no private use. It's led to huge ethical issues. It's led to safety issues. And generally the reason why was because people abused the system. They would use something and they wouldn't essentially replace it. They wouldn't treat it as if it were their own stuff. So my advice is, this is one where you want to be pretty explicit and say what's allowed, what's not allowed. But then of course you run into issues of what is actually allowed by law. As an example, a lot of superintendents have a pickup truck. They can't use it except for work-related activities. But if they're driving from their house back to work or vice versa, going from work home, are they okay to stop and pick up milk on the way home? Well, that comes down to both, did you put it in writing? And is there an ethics policy? These are all things you gotta be careful of. You may not want to put everything in writing, but something to think about. What do you need to put in writing? And what are the penalties if something does happen? Speaking of which, most people who work for DPWs have to have a CDL license, or maybe their job requires some other license, like a crane operator or an engineer has to have a professional engineering license. Licensing is pretty important. If people are required to have it for their job, you need to be explicit about saying what their requirements are. And then, of course, it'll come down to some of the other issues that come up with testing, which we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. But I'm just wondering, because I'm curious, we're curious about this here, but just how are you handling the new CDL requirements? What are you doing about the new CDL requirements that require essentially people get trained through a specific process? Okay, so let's see, does anybody have anything they're doing to handle the CDL requirements? I'll tell you what we've seen around the state. Not applicable, okay, so you don't have a requirement for CDL for any of your employees. you're doing a cooperative agreement with the BOCES. That's actually pretty common. You may want to check with your BOCES. Okay. We do know of departments who are setting up to become a CDL. There we go. We have become a CDL training facility. Okay. The key here is, as long as you're not charging, the rules are simple. Okay. You can train your own people, but you have to be set up as a facility with the new rules. And you can do contract training, but if you can keep the price zero, it changes what paperwork you have to do. So my advice is think about that when you're setting things up. Okay. By the way, back on the last question, somebody put in the Q&A mentioning the fact that if people see the highway trucks at the diner or Wegmans or things like that, that becomes an issue. Do people have, do you want to stop someone picking up a donut or coffee or even lunch when they're out working? On the other hand, what's it say? What's the department look like if there's a pickup truck sitting in the parking lot? So again, you may want to think about putting that in writing, or maybe thinking about putting that into something that's a little bit honest to the public and say, hey, here's what we're doing. You might be able to solve that problem in a different way. Okay. Now, we could spend hours talking about grievance and discipline procedures. Okay. In fact, if you read the Preble policy and download it, you'll see it's one of the longest segments where we talk about, oral warnings and written warnings and suspensions and direct firing and what is the procedure and what is the grievance procedure if something happens. These are almost always in writing, either in the contract or in the employee handbook. And again, we could spend a whole hour on this. But you definitely want to have this written down. What is the policy for when you're doing certain actions? What I'd like to know, just in your brain, think about this. And as you're developing your grievance procedure or even negotiating it in the contract, just ask yourself, what are examples of actions that require discipline? If you had to start listing things that require discipline, what are those things? Okay. And again, I'll pull up let the answers come up here. Okay. Continually being late. Yep. Okay. Is it one time, 2 times, 3 times? Fighting? Yeah, that's a pretty obvious one. Yeah. Okay. Insubordination. That, by the way, is one of those things that may actually be fireable, directly fireable, depending. Okay. Skipping work. Okay. Like being truants at school. Drug or alcohol use, which, by the way, may affect their licensure. Sexual harassment was in the Q&A. That's a very important one. Or violence on work, destruction of property. Yep. All really good answers. But as you're developing your policy, make a list of the things you've had to deal with and decide which ones do you need to put in writing. Did you need to say, nope, we need to have a list, be explicit. Sometimes we want to be implicit, but there are times when you want to be explicit. If you're abusing time, if you don't have the licensure, did you not follow certain standards? And again, for each of these, is this a serious offense and it becomes you're suspended or fired almost immediately? Or is it the step process going from oral to written to the suspension and then finally firing? Whatever you set for policy, remember, you now got to follow. So be very aware of that fact as you're going through and you're setting up your procedure and where you want to go with things. Okay. Keeping records is one, by the way, that y'all didn't mention, which I think is really important because it protects the municipality from liability. And you may want to put that one down. A lot of this comes back to ethics. Okay. What is your, ethics? Does your department, does the town, does the county have an ethics policy? Is it yes, no, you're not sure, we should, or none of the above? And let me just pop that up. Most of you are going to say yes, I hope. If you're not sure, you need to check. And again, if you've got a policy that was approved by the board, you may just want to link to that policy and make sure everybody knows where it is so that they know what they have to do and what they have to follow. Because usually that's a disciplinary activity as well. So keep that in mind as we're developing things. And of course, a lot of that comes back to the fact that by rule, you're supposed to have an ethics policy. So you probably do have one, you just may not realize it. And if the board didn't share it with you, well, they have to do that. That's actually spoilable, but I hate to do that. But I've seen the highway departments having to foil a policy they're supposed to follow. Strange. Of course, that leads to the question of alcohol and drug testing, which goes back to licensure. It goes to issues of discipline. It is something we have to have a drug and alcohol testing policy. It's required when you've got CDL licensure. Probably have an outside agency doing the work with both random testing, pre-employment, reasonable suspension, after a crash, things like that. But one that I'm just wondering about real quickly, we'll just ask this. How is your department handling essentially the new marijuana use? Because that's a little harder to test. I'm just curious. And how are we going to put that in writing in our employee handbooks as we move forward? Let's see. Don't ask, don't tell. Okay. Nice thing about this, it's all anonymous. I don't know who did it. So we're not recording this. All right, we're recording the webinar to share, but we're not recording who wrote down what answer. So we don't know who did this. That's great. Don't ask, don't tell. If they're required for CDL, they're not allowed to use. Yeah, think about that. There's a difference between state law and federal law. Federal law still prohibits the use of marijuana. Okay. And so who's tested? Who do you test in your department for any drug? And how do you handle this? This is one of those things that will definitely change employee handbooks as we move forward. And I'll tell you right now, I don't have a specific answer for you. I wish I did, but it's something you need to think about. And what is marijuana free? If people are allowed to smoke and you go through a cloud and suddenly you test positive, what happens? Okay. And that leads me to one of the more critical things. You want to think about what are safety sensitive functions. These are things where you can't be on drugs. You really shouldn't be doing them when you're tired. But think about what is a safety sensitive function. There's a list in the Preble, the handbook our policy that we're sharing with you. But I actually think there's more items that we should be thinking about that are safety sensitive. These are things where you really want to make sure someone is doing them right. Obviously, driving a truck, operating heavy equipment, these certainly fall into a list of safety sensitive functions. But are there other things that are safety sensitive that you really want to make sure somebody is doing well? Yeah, flagging traffic is a safety sensitive function. Going into confined space, operating electric equipment, okay? Driving, obviously a lot of it's driven around equipment, but think about other things that you do that if somebody was slightly drunk or high, they couldn't do it. Does that become a standard operating procedure? Do you put those standard operating procedures as part of your employee handbook, or are they separate? If they are separate, and that's okay, make sure you list in the employee handbook where they can find the standard operating procedures that they need to follow. And then make sure those aren't overly complicated as well. Okay. Couple of last things, we'll get you going out of here after an hour. I'm just wondering with light duty, do you even have light duty? A lot of agencies have gotten rid of light duty. This allows somebody who's injured to come back and work on lighter work short term. And let's see what we've got. Yes, for some positions, no, or case-by-case basis. Here's the thing is, I actually like the concept of the case-by-case basis, but how do we write that so that we're fair to everybody? And that's why a lot of folks have eliminated it, because it's just hard to put in writing. But if you can come up with a way to do it, that can actually be a useful tool to both retain people and to bring people back. But again, what do you put in writing? Things like promotions. How do you promote people? That's a pretty important question that we don't always think about. Okay. How do you give out your promotions? And somebody did, by the way, say for light duty, you have to have a reasonable accommodation to come back. Yeah. And that's something to think about. And by the way, there is ADA issues that still come into play. How do you give your promotions, by the way? How do you promote people? And do you need to put that in writing? If you have a contract, it's probably part of the contract. It may be based on seniority, but how do you give promotions? And these are the kind of things you need to think about. Do you need to put them in writing or not? Do you give performance-based promotions? Do you give performance-based raises for those who don't have a contract? Or is it all done with the contract? the goal of all of this is put as much in writing as you need, but don't put it in writing until there's a need. But when you do, write it well. Keep it simple, okay? You might test for people. Civil service allows you to test to move people up. And you might use seniority. You might use seniority only. You might use it with skills. Again, think about it. Will vary quite a bit. Two last items that I think is two more. Let me just make sure my list here. Yep, two more last items. One of them is purchasing. Obviously, not everybody needs to know the full purchasing policy for the agency. Towns have to have a purchasing policy, but when they can go get oral quotes, when they have to have written ones, when they go out to bid, you're probably not going to put that in the employee handbook. You're going to reference it. But the question is, do you know your own purchasing policy? Okay. Yes, no, we don't have one. Not sure if you have one or none of the above. Let's see. Do you know your purchasing policy? And again, this is a case where you're probably going to reference the policy in the handbook. You're going to say the policy is here, or you could put in specific things that are useful. But again, be careful. If you put in there any purchase over $50 has to be approved by the superintendent, and the board changes the number, now you create a conflict. So be careful about that. Okay. So things like this should be in there. Somebody has thrown in, by the way, other things you could throw in. Do you have a licensed event notification for CDL people? We could go crazy with policies. Make sure you know how you train your people. How do you do purchase orders? All those kind of fun things. We could go crazy with all kinds of stuff. But the thing about it is, I just want you to think about, as you start building your handbook up that you're going to send to employees, think about how you're going to train people. That should actually be part of your handbook, so people know what their options are to make themselves better. It actually helps recruit them and keep them on board and gives them ideas of how they might be able to get into the promotions. At the end of the day, you're going to write a handbook. Write one for your agency. Keep it simple. Don't make it overly complicated. So go get some from others. And again, I'm going to ask you again, please, if you're willing, share them with us. Our email is going to be on the next slide, the last slide. But keep it simple and don't go crazy. Okay? So again, if you've got one you're willing to share, we'll throw them up on our website. You can click in the chat pod link, or it's on the screen right here. We'd love to see good ones. If you've got one. And with that, hopefully you've got a good policy, and hopefully you rewrite the one you've got, because remember, it's a living document. Everybody have yourself a great day. Next week, we got pavement maintenance, and hopefully we'll see you on the road in the spring. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.